I stood in the middle of a ballroom dripping in imported crystal, wearing a cheap mustard yellow polyester dress that made my skin itch. Across the room, my sister's new husband raised his glass, flashing a smug, triumphant smile. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally put me and my blue-collar husband in our proper place. He had no idea that the silver tray heading toward his head table did not hold complimentary champagne. It held a $12,000 penalty invoice, paperclipped to the exact same crinkled $5 bill he had thrown at my husband's chest 2 weeks earlier. Before I explain how a simple valet tip turned into financial ruin for the groom, if you know what it feels like to be the black sheep of your family, hit the like button and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the day the trap was set. My name is Julie Roberts. I am 32 years old, working as a logistics manager in Huntsville, Alabama. My husband Ethan is a quiet man. He favors faded flannel shirts, worn-in work boots, and drives a 1998 Ford F-150 that squeaks when it idles. To my younger sister Caroline, Ethan was a walking stereotype, a stain on our pristine family image. The nightmare began on a suffocatingly humid Sunday afternoon in our parents' living room. The air conditioning hummed, struggling against the thick southern heat, while Caroline paraded around handing out her gold-foiled wedding invitations. The thick cardstock felt heavy, expensive. When she reached my chair, she paused. Her manicured fingers tapped the crisp white envelope. "Julie, I only reserved one seat for you," she said, her voice bright and hollow. I stared at the single name printed on the front. I asked where Ethan's invitation was. Caroline sighed, tilting her head like she was explaining basic math to a toddler. "He is a poor nobody, Julie. Look at him. He will ruin the aesthetic of the photos. This is a black tie event at the Grand Magnolia, not a backyard barbecue." My fingernails dug into my palm so hard the skin turned white. The living room went dead silent. My mother stared intently at her china teacup, refusing to meet my eyes. I opened my mouth, the heat rising in my chest, preparing to tear the invitation in half, but movement in the corner caught my eye. Ethan sat in my father's floral armchair, his rough hands wrapped around a glass of sweet tea. He did not flush. He did not look away. He caught my gaze and gave a single, slow shake of his head. His eyes held a quiet, terrifying calm. We left the house 10 minutes later without raising our voices. I sat in the passenger seat of his old truck, the engine rumbling beneath my feet, my blood boiling. Caroline thought she had won. She thought she could erase my husband from her perfect high society day just because his boots had mud on them. What she did not know was that the man she just banned from the Grand Magnolia owned the ground it was built on. The next morning tasted like bitter coffee and unresolved anger. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the heavy cream envelope sitting next to my mug. The gold foil lettering caught the early sunlight, flashing like a neon warning sign. Caroline and Preston. The elegant cursive words seemed to mock me from the granite countertop. I traced the raised ink with my thumbnail, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. In normal families, a mother would step in after a stunt like the one Caroline pulled yesterday. A mother would demand an apology for such blatant disrespect. A mother would bridge the gap. I picked up my phone and dialed Valerie Roberts, expecting at least a shred of maternal mediation. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. I could hear the delicate clinking of silverware on fine china and the low hum of classical music in the background. She was already seated at the country club for her weekly brunch. I took a deep breath, forcing my tone to remain level and calm. I told her about the invitation. I told her Caroline had publicly humiliated my husband in our own childhood home. I waited for the gasp, the sympathetic sigh, the promise to speak to my sister and set things right. Instead, a heavy silence stretched across the cellular line. When Valerie finally spoke, her voice dripped with a cold, practiced condescension that sent a shiver down my spine. "Julie, please be reasonable," she sighed. I could practically see her waving a dismissive, manicured hand in the air. "Caroline is under a tremendous amount of stress right now. She is marrying Preston Caldwell. You know his family. They are prominent Birmingham finance people. They have a certain image to uphold for their corporate circle." I blinked, the words echoing loudly in my quiet kitchen. An image. I asked her what Ethan had to do with their precious image. My mother lowered her voice, taking on that quiet, lecturing tone she used whenever she thought I was being slow to understand the ways of the world. "Ethan is a good man, Julie, but look at him." She paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "He works in the dirt. He wears those dreadful work boots and faded flannel shirts everywhere he goes. He drives a rusted truck that looks like it belongs in a salvage yard. Caroline just wants everything to look cohesive and elegant for the wedding photos. She does not want to explain your husband to Preston's wealthy business partners." Works in the dirt. The phrase hit my chest like a physical blow. A cold rush of adrenaline flooded my veins, bringing decades of blatant family favoritism bubbling right to the surface. I looked down at my own hands, remembering the years of paper cuts and calluses. I grew up earning every single dollar in my bank account. I worked late shifts, smelling like grease at a local diner, to pay for my state college tuition, while Caroline drove a brand new leased SUV my parents happily financed. I clipped grocery coupons in my tiny first apartment, while my sister swiped platinum credit cards handed to her by our father. They called it investing in Caroline's future. They called my struggles building character. But the deepest irony, the part that made my blood burn hot in my veins, was a vivid memory from just last September. A late-season hurricane had swept through the Gulf Coast, pushing brutal winds all the way up into the Appalachian foothills. A heavy oak branch had crashed through the roof of my parents' home, exposing their formal dining room to the pouring rain. They panicked. Roofers were booked out for months across the entire state. Who showed up to help them? Not the Caldwells. Preston Caldwell, the prominent Birmingham finance prince, did not even bother to send a text message to check on his future in-laws. He was too busy posting curated photos from a luxury ski resort in Aspen, far away from the storm damage. Ethan, the man who supposedly worked in the dirt, drove his squeaking Ford truck through flooded back roads to reach them. He spent 3 grueling days up on their roof in the blistering post-storm heat. I remember standing in the yard, watching him haul heavy bundles of asphalt shingles up an aluminum ladder, his knuckles scraped and bleeding, his flannel shirt soaked in sweat. He patched their home for free. He saved them thousands of dollars and weeks of catastrophic water damage. I reminded my mother of this fact. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. I reminded her who actually showed up when the sky fell on their heads. Valerie scoffed, a short, sharp sound that dismissed my entire argument in a single breath. "That was very kind of Ethan, and we thanked him, Julie, but fixing a roof is manual labor. A wedding is a high-class social event. They are 2 entirely different worlds. You need to stop being so sensitive and think about the bigger picture. This is Caroline's social debut into Birmingham high society. I am warning you right now, do not cause a scene and ruin this for her." The line went quiet. She did not ask if I was coming. She demanded my quiet compliance. She expected me to swallow the insult, show up alone, and hide my husband away like a dirty secret, all to protect the fragile ego of a rich boy who had never worked a hard day in his life. The conflict shifted right then. It morphed from a petty, toxic sibling rivalry into a profound, irrevocable family betrayal. My mother had just drawn a permanent line in the sand, and she placed Ethan and me firmly on the outside. I realized my family measured human worth entirely by bank accounts, designer labels, and country club memberships. Loyalty meant nothing to them. Character meant nothing. Sweat and sacrifice meant nothing. The call without saying goodbye, dropping the phone onto the counter. The silence in my kitchen felt deafening. I looked at the gold-foiled invitation resting on the granite. The cursive letters seemed to taunt me. I reached out, my fingers gripping the thick paper. I was ready to rip it into 100 tiny pieces. I was ready to throw it in the trash, block their numbers, and cut the toxic ties forever. I did not need their approval. We had our own life. Just as my hands tightened on the paper, the front screen door groaned open. Heavy footsteps thudded against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Ethan walked into the kitchen, returning from his morning run. He wore an old gray t-shirt, dark with sweat across the chest, and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His breathing was steady, rhythmic. He stopped by the island, pouring himself a tall glass of ice water. He took a long drink, his chest rising and falling, before his bright green eyes locked onto mine. He saw the unshed tears of frustration burning in my eyes. He saw the invitation crinkling in my white-knuckled grip. Without asking a single question, he knew exactly what had happened. He knew the call I had just made and the bitter betrayal I had just swallowed. He stepped closer, the scent of crisp morning air and pine needles clinging to his skin. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently covering my trembling fingers. He slowly pulled the invitation away from my grip, smoothing out the creased edges on the counter. I looked up at him, my voice cracking as I told him I was not going. I told him we were done with them. I told him nobody gets to treat my husband like a stray dog on the porch. Ethan wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his expression shifting into a calm, slow smile. It was not a smile of defeat. It was the smile of a man holding a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. "Go ahead and RSVP yes for one," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. I stared at him, bewildered by the request. I asked him why on earth I would subject myself to a room full of people who looked down on us. I asked him why I should celebrate a sister who treated him like garbage. Ethan picked up his water glass, leaning his hip against the counter. He looked out the kitchen window, gazing at the battered Ford truck parked in our driveway. "Because, Julie," he said softly, looking back at me with a dangerous, calculating spark in his eyes, "I promise you are going to want a front row seat to the karma they are about to bring down on their own heads." I stood in my kitchen, staring at my husband. He was a man of few words, a man who never made empty promises. Beneath the faded flannel and the quiet demeanor, a storm was brewing. I had no idea what kind of trap he was planning, or what secret he held in his back pocket, but as I reached for a pen to check the attendance box on the RSVP card, I knew one thing for certain. Preston Caldwell and my sister were walking blindly into a nightmare, and I was going to wear my front row ticket like a badge of honor. 14 days remained until the wedding. The countdown felt like a ticking clock in the back of my mind, echoing louder with every passing hour. Caroline decided that our family required a mandatory dinner to discuss proper etiquette. The chosen battleground was an upscale, dim-lit steakhouse in downtown Birmingham, the kind of establishment where menus lack price tags and the waiters wear white cotton gloves. It was a thinly veiled excuse for my sister to dictate how I should behave around her future high society in-laws. My reliable but aging sedan had decided to break down that very morning, a blown alternator leaving me stranded in our driveway. Ethan, without a single complaint, offered to drop me off. The drive to Birmingham took nearly an hour. I sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's 1998 Ford truck, the worn fabric of the bench seat scratching against the back of my formal black dress. The engine rumbled with a deep, throaty cough, vibrating through the floorboards. Ethan kept one calloused hand on the steering wheel, the other resting comfortably on his thigh. He wore his usual attire, a faded red flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows, denim jeans, and scuffed work boots. He looked entirely out of place, heading toward the wealthiest zip code in the city. I felt a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I hated subjecting him to my family's judgment, but Ethan just turned up the radio, humming along to a classic country song. He carried a quiet confidence that no amount of money could buy. We pulled into the circular driveway of the steakhouse. The valet lane was a parade of European engineering. Sleek silver Porsches, pristine black Range Rovers, and gleaming Lexuses lined the curb. Ethan's rusted truck idled loudly in the center of it all, the squeaking fan belt echoing off the brick facade of the restaurant. A young valet in a crisp uniform hesitated, unsure if he should approach the window. Before Ethan could even shift into park, a brand-new leased Mercedes-Benz swept into the lane right behind us, hitting the horn with a sharp, impatient blast. The driver's side door of the Mercedes popped open. Preston Caldwell stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of a tailored navy suit that cost more than my first car. He wore a heavy gold watch that caught the ambient streetlights, gleaming like a beacon of arrogance. Caroline emerged from the passenger side, teetering on designer heels, her lips painted a severe shade of crimson. Preston took one look at the battered tailgate of Ethan's truck and let out a loud, mocking laugh. His voice carried across the quiet valet lane, turning the heads of several wealthy patrons waiting by the heavy oak doors. "Hey, buddy," Preston called out, a smug grin plastered across his face. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. He flicked his wrist, tossing the wrinkled green paper straight through the open window of the truck. It hit Ethan square in the chest and fluttered down onto his lap. "Do not scratch the real cars on your way out," Preston sneered. "Buy yourself a car wash while you are at it." Caroline covered her mouth, giggling like a cruel high school teenager. The valet looked mortified, staring down at his polished shoes. My vision blurred red. I reached for the door handle, ready to climb out and unleash years of pent-up fury on the pavement. But Ethan stopped me. His rough hand shot out, gently gripping my forearm. He looked down at the $5 bill, picked it up, and smoothed the creases against his denim-clad knee. He did not yell. He did not flush with embarrassment. He simply leaned his head out the window, locked eyes with the young valet, and handed him the cash. "Keep the change for him," Ethan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He needs it more than I do." Ethan turned to me, offering a quick, reassuring wink. "Have a good dinner, Jules. Call me when you are ready to be picked up." He shifted the truck into drive and pulled away, the squeaking engine fading into the humid Alabama night. I stood on the curb, smoothing the skirt of my dress, forcing my spine to straighten. Preston and Caroline strutted past me, linking arms, looking incredibly pleased with their little performance. I swallowed my pride, pasting a polite, hollow smile on my face, and followed them through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant. The interior of the steakhouse smelled of aged beef, rich red wine, and expensive cologne. My parents were already seated at a large circular booth in the back, sipping sparkling water. The moment Preston arrived, Valerie and Clayton practically tripped over themselves to greet him. They fawned over his suit, asked about his recent golf handicap, and praised his choice of venue. I sat quietly on the edge of the leather booth, sipping a glass of ice water, rendered entirely invisible by the glowing aura of the Caldwell wealth. For the next hour, Preston held court. He dominated the conversation, swirling a glass of neat scotch while boasting endlessly about the wedding budget. He dropped exorbitant numbers into the conversation with calculated precision. He bragged about the rare imported flowers, the custom silk linens, and the sheer amount of money his family was funneling into the Grand Magnolia. According to Preston, the venue management should be kissing the ground he walked on. He leaned back against the leather booth, unbuttoning his suit jacket, wearing the expression of a conquering king. "But you know how it is with these places," Preston sighed dramatically, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You pay top dollar, and you still have to deal with incompetent help. I was on the phone with the event coordinator today, demanding a complimentary upgrade to the presidential suite for the weekend. Do you know what she told me? She said the owner has strict policies against comping luxury suites. The owner. As if I care what some faceless corporate suit dictates. I am bringing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue." Preston scoffed, shaking his head. "And their maintenance staff is a joke. I heard from a vendor that they currently have a severe plumbing issue in one of the guest wings. Can you imagine? I am paying for perfection, and they have blue-collar grunts crawling around in the dirt fixing pipes right before my big day." He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Actually, Julie, maybe your husband is out there right now holding a wrench. That seems to be his speed." My mother offered a tight, nervous laugh, shooting me a warning glare across the table. I sat perfectly still. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted a metallic hint of copper. Preston's words echoed in my mind. A plumbing issue, blue-collar grunts. Suddenly, a very specific memory clicked into place. 3 nights ago, I had walked into our home office and found Ethan studying a wide set of architectural blueprints spread across his desk. When I asked him what he was doing, he casually mentioned he was doing some pipe inspections and reviewing structural reports for a property down south. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water. My family assumed Ethan was just a contracted plumber. Because he wore flannel, drove a rusty truck, and knew how to fix a roof, they boxed him into a category of servitude. They thought he was hired to fix the toilets at the resort. I looked at Preston, swirling his expensive scotch, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. I looked at Caroline, nodding along with every arrogant word spilling from his mouth. They had constructed an entire narrative based on their own shallow prejudices. I did not correct them. I let the silence hang over my side of the table. I let them believe my husband was a lowly vendor, scraping by on hourly wages. The tension inside me transformed. It was no longer a burning, reactive anger. It became a coiled spring, tight and focused. I was sitting at a table with people who were digging their own graves with diamond-encrusted shovels. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so obsessed with maintaining a fragile illusion of superiority, that they could not see the heavy steel jaws of the trap closing directly around their ankles. As the waiter returned to clear our dinner plates, the atmosphere shifted. Preston checked his gold watch, signaling that he was growing bored with the evening. Caroline, sensing the lull in attention, sat up straighter, her eyes locked onto me, gleaming with a fresh, cruel intent. She reached down into the shopping bag resting at her feet, preparing to launch her next attack. She was not finished humiliating me, and before the dessert menus even hit the table, she pulled out a long zippered garment bag, ensuring the evening would end on her terms. The waitstaff glided through the dim steakhouse, silently clearing our heavy ceramic dinner plates. A waiter in a crisp white apron placed leather-bound dessert menus in the center of the table, but before anyone could even glance at the selection of imported truffles and aged ports, the atmosphere shifted. Caroline sat up straighter, adjusting the cuffs of her silk blouse. Her eyes locked onto me, gleaming with a fresh, cruel intent. She reached down into the oversized designer shopping bag resting near her feet, preparing to launch her next calculated attack. She was far from finished humiliating me, and she intended to ensure this evening ended entirely on her terms. With a dramatic sigh designed to draw the attention of the entire booth, Caroline hoisted a long, black plastic garment bag onto her lap. The harsh sound of the plastic zipper tearing open sliced through the soft hum of the restaurant. She reached inside and pulled out a dress. Under the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers, the garment looked even worse than I could have imagined. It was a hideous, ill-fitting bridesmaid gown in a shade of mustard yellow that resembled a faded bruise. The fabric was cheap, shiny polyester, the kind that catches on dry skin and retains static electricity. It featured a high, ruffled neckline that looked like a leftover costume from a low-budget theater production. Next to the sleek, tailored silhouettes her wealthy Birmingham friends would be wearing, this dress was a visual punishment. It was a neon sign pointing directly at my supposed inferiority. Caroline smoothed the scratchy fabric over her knee, tilting her head with a practiced, fake, pitying smile. "I know money is tight right now, Julie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Since Ethan barely scrapes by with his little odd jobs, I did not want you to stress over the financial burden of the bridal party, so I went ahead and bought this for you. You have to wear it. It fits the rustic aesthetic I am going for with the family portraits." The table fell silent. It was a deliberate power play, an execution of status right there in the middle of the steakhouse. She wanted to strip away my dignity and force me to stand at the altar looking frumpy, impoverished, and desperate next to her flawless high society friends. She wanted Preston's family to look at me and feel an overwhelming sense of superiority. Valerie clapped her hands together, breaking the silence, her face lighting up with forced enthusiasm. "Oh, Caroline, that is so thoughtful of you," my mother chimed in, reaching over to pat my sister on the arm. "You see, Julie, your sister is looking out for you. It is such a generous gift. You should be grateful she is including you in the bridal party photos at all, given the circumstances." My father, Clayton, kept his eyes glued to his half-empty water glass, choosing cowardice over defending his eldest daughter. Preston merely smirked, swirling the last drop of scotch in his tumbler, highly entertained by the entire spectacle. I reached out and took the plastic hanger from Caroline. The fabric felt rough and industrial against my fingertips, like a cheap window curtain. I recognized the distinct cut and the missing brand tag near the collar. This was a clearance rack reject from a discount outlet, probably tossed into a bargain bin for $10. I looked at Caroline's smug face. I looked at my mother's demanding glare. I could have thrown the dress back across the table. I could have pointed out the missing stitches on the hem, but I swallowed the insult. I nodded slowly, folding the garment bag over my arm, and thanked my sister for her overwhelming generosity. I agreed to wear it, absorbing their smug superiority without a single word of protest. I let them enjoy their victory. But what they did not know, what they could not possibly fathom as they sat there glowing with unearned pride, was that the Caldwell facade was already beginning to fracture. That very afternoon, while I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking iced tea, my cell phone had buzzed with a call from a close friend named Hannah. Hannah runs one of the most exclusive floral design studios in Birmingham, catering strictly to high-end corporate events and luxury weddings. We went to college together, and she has always kept her ear close to the ground within the tight-knit wedding vendor network. Her voice had been hushed and urgent over the phone. "Julie, you did not hear this from me," Hannah whispered, "but your future brother-in-law is in serious trouble." Hannah explained that the Caldwells, the prominent finance family my mother worshipped, were quietly bleeding cash. Preston's father had been dodging phone calls from the catering company for over a week. The deposit check Preston handed the luxury transportation service had bounced twice. Hoping to hide the financial rot, Preston had been frantically calling vendors behind Caroline's back, demanding aggressive discounts and threatening to cancel orders if they did not slash their prices. Hannah herself had been forced to downgrade the centerpieces from imported white orchids to basic white carnations, explicitly instructed by Preston to hide the cheaper flowers in the back of the ballroom so the guests would not notice. But the real crisis, Hannah revealed, was happening at the Grand Magnolia. Preston was ruthless when cornered. Desperate to save thousands of dollars, he had spent the morning bullying the head event coordinator at the resort. He demanded they provide the $5,000 a night presidential suite entirely for free. His excuse was that his family brought prestige to the hotel. When the coordinator politely explained that complimentary upgrades of that magnitude were against resort policy, Preston turned vicious. He threatened to drag the venue's name through the mud on social media, promising to leave scathing reviews that would ruin their reputation in the hospitality industry. He screamed at the young woman over the phone, throwing his weight around like a wounded animal backed into a corner. He was drowning, and his inflated ego was the only thing keeping him afloat. What Preston did not realize as he screamed at the hotel staff was that the resort did not belong to a faceless corporate entity. It belonged to the man wearing a faded flannel shirt, currently driving a squeaking 1998 Ford truck back to Huntsville. After I hung up with Hannah that afternoon, I had walked out to the driveway where Ethan was checking the oil in his truck. I relayed every single word Hannah told me. I told him about the bounced checks, the downgraded carnations, and the vicious threats Preston made to the resort coordinator. Ethan wiped his hands on a greasy shop towel, his expression turning cold and hard. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed the direct line to the general manager of the Grand Magnolia. I stood right there in the driveway and listened to my blue-collar husband issue a set of ironclad directives. "You treat the Caldwell party exactly like any other guest," Ethan had instructed, his voice low and uncompromising. "You do not waive a single fee, you do not grant a single grace period, you hold them to the exact letter of the fine print in their contract. If they miss a deadline, you bill them. If they break a rule, you penalize them. Do not bend a single inch." The general manager agreed without hesitation. The trap was armed, and Ethan had locked the cage. Sitting in the dim light of the steakhouse, gripping the scratchy mustard fabric of the clearance rack dress, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Preston bragged about his wealth, but his bank accounts were running on fumes. Caroline mocked my husband, entirely unaware that Ethan held the deed to her perfect day. They thought they held all the cards, but they were playing a game they had already lost. The waiter returned, placing a delicate lemon tart in front of me. I picked up my silver fork, smiling warmly at my sister. The mustard dress rested safely on the leather bench beside me. I was going to wear it. I was going to wear it with pride, because it would serve as the perfect visual reminder of their cruelty when the walls finally caved in. Preston took another arrogant sip of his expensive scotch, adjusting his heavy gold watch, totally oblivious to the storm gathering right above his head. He was desperate to maintain his illusion of power, but his temper was about to push him right over the edge. Behind the velvet ropes of Birmingham high society, the Caldwell family name had once commanded unwavering respect. Preston grew up in a world of private school uniforms, exclusive golf memberships, and lavish summer vacations, believing his bloodline granted him immunity from the struggles of regular people. But legacy does not automatically generate liquidity. The truth, hidden deep within their corporate ledgers, painted a much darker picture. The family finance firm had lost several key clients over the last 3 years. Their sprawling estate in the suburbs was heavily mortgaged. The gleaming Mercedes he paraded around town was leased under the business account. They were running on financial fumes, maintaining a perilous balancing act to keep up appearances. To Preston, his public image was his oxygen. Without the illusion of endless wealth, his entire identity would crumble into dust. This desperate reality fueled his toxic behavior leading up to the wedding. He needed the event to look like a $1 million affair while spending a mere fraction of that amount. 3 days after our tense steakhouse dinner, Preston's fragile ego collided directly with Ethan's ironclad directives, and the facade began to crack in real time. The incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Preston dialed the executive office of the Grand Magnolia, seeking out the general manager, a seasoned hospitality veteran named Jonathan. Hoping to squeeze more free amenities out of the resort to hide his dwindling budget, Preston demanded 5 cases of imported vintage champagne be delivered to the bridal suite upon arrival, free of charge. He claimed a previous booking agent had promised the complimentary upgrade and insisted Jonathan honor the verbal agreement immediately. Jonathan, having received strict orders from my husband to enforce every single line of the contract, held his ground. He politely informed the groom that hotel ownership policies strictly prohibited complimentary luxury alcohol packages without prior written authorization from the board. Jonathan offered to add the cases to the final invoice at the standard premium rate, ensuring the bridal party would have their drinks waiting for them. That simple refusal acted as a lit match dropped into a powder keg. Preston lost whatever shred of composure he had left. The polished, sophisticated finance executive vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate bully. He began screaming into the receiver. He hurled harsh profanities at the manager, demanding immediate compliance. When Jonathan calmly reiterated the venue rules, Preston pushed all his chips onto the table. "Do you know who I am?" Preston roared, his voice echoing through the phone line with a sharp, frantic edge. "I am bringing your second-rate establishment more exposure than you deserve. I will have the owner fire you before the weekend is over. You will be blacklisted from working in this state ever again." He ranted for another 2 minutes, issuing severe threats against the resort staff and promising to drag the hotel through a vicious social media smear campaign. He demanded Jonathan grovel for forgiveness and deliver the champagne, or he would pull the entire wedding and sue the property for emotional distress. What the arrogant groom failed to realize was that high-end luxury resorts operate under strict security protocols. Every incoming call to the executive office was recorded for quality assurance and legal protection. Jonathan did not flinch. He let Preston scream until his throat grew raw. Then, the manager politely wished him a good afternoon and disconnected the call. Jonathan did not scramble to fulfill the demand. He did not issue an apology. Instead, he opened his email client, attached the digital audio file of the unhinged rant, and forwarded the recording directly to the private inbox of the majority owner. That evening, I drove home from my logistics office, feeling the familiar weight of the impending wedding pressing down on my shoulders. I parked my sedan in the driveway, noticing Ethan's rusted Ford truck already resting in its usual spot. The humid evening air felt thick and heavy as I walked up the front steps, eager to change out of my work clothes and escape the lingering stress of the day. I pushed open the front door, slipping my shoes off in the hallway. The house was quiet, save for a strange, harsh voice echoing from the back of the house. I followed the sound, my brow furrowing in confusion. The noise was coming from our small home office down the corridor. I stepped into the doorway and stopped in my tracks. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the fresh pot of dark roast coffee Ethan had just brewed. My husband sat at his heavy wooden desk, illuminated by the cool blue light of his laptop screen. He wore his favorite faded red flannel shirt, his broad shoulders relaxed against the back of his leather chair. Coming from the computer speakers was the unmistakable, frantic voice of my future brother-in-law. I listened in stunned silence as Preston's recorded meltdown filled our quiet home. I heard the venom in his tone, the pathetic desperation masquerading as authority, and the empty threats hurled at the hotel staff. "Do you know who I am?" the recorded voice shrieked one final time before the audio clip ended with a sharp click. Ethan reached out and closed the laptop. The sudden silence in the room felt electric. He did not look angry. There was no rage in his posture. Instead, his green eyes held a sharp, calculating gleam. He looked exactly like a seasoned chess master who had just cornered his opponent king on the final row of the board. He leaned back, interlacing his rough fingers over his chest, and offered me a slow, quiet smile. "Let them dig the hole, Julie," he said softly, his voice a soothing contrast to the chaotic audio we had just endured. I brought the shovel. I walked over to the desk, staring at the closed silver lid of the laptop. The magnitude of what Preston had just done washed over me. By verbally abusing the staff and issuing direct threats to the business, the groom had blatantly violated the strict code of conduct clause buried in the fine print of his luxury venue contract. Section 4, paragraph 2, clearly stated that any harassment of hotel employees would result in immediate cancellation of the event at the discretion of the ownership team. Preston had essentially handed Ethan the legal right to cancel the entire event without refunding a single dime. Preston thought he was putting a lowly hotel manager in his place. He thought his empty threats would secure his false image of wealth and power. Instead, he had delivered his own head on a silver platter to the very man he had mocked in the steakhouse driveway just a few days prior. He had armed the trap, locked himself inside, and handed the remote detonator directly to my husband. The fuse was officially lit. Preston's toxic arrogance was about to cost him the one thing he valued most in the world. His curated, perfect public image was hanging by a frayed thread, and Ethan held the scissors. But before the final trap could snap shut, we had to survive the rehearsal dinner. The Caldwells, still entirely blind to the impending disaster, were planning an exclusive gathering at their private country club the night before the ceremony. Preston, feeling empowered by his own delusions of grandeur, would undoubtedly use the opportunity to assert his dominance one last time. He wanted an audience for his cruelty, and he expected me to sit quietly in my cheap mustard dress while he delivered the final blow. I went to our bedroom to pack my overnight bag, feeling the adrenaline hum beneath my skin, knowing the upcoming night would push the tension far past the breaking point. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived with the thick, suffocating heat typical of an Alabama summer. While the Caldwell family and their elite social circle prepared to gather at the most exclusive country club in the county, my husband and I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a cheap roadside motel 2 miles down the highway. A flickering neon vacancy sign cast a pale pink glow over the hood of Ethan's rusted truck. Staying true to Caroline's cruel ban, Ethan had booked this rundown room to wait for me. I stood in front of the scratched mirror above the motel sink staring at my reflection. The mustard yellow polyester dress clung to my skin, the cheap synthetic fabric trapping the humid air and making me itch along the collar line. It was a garment designed to punish the wearer. I looked like a discarded afterthought, a stark contrast to the elegant image my sister so desperately wanted to project. Ethan stood behind me in the mirror's reflection, wearing his usual faded flannel. He reached out, resting his rough, warm hands on my shoulders, grounding me in the present moment. He told me to keep my chin up. He promised the discomfort would be worth the final payoff. I left him sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress, drove my newly repaired sedan down the dark stretch of highway, and turned into the towering iron gates of the country club. The venue was a sprawling estate of manicured golf greens and stark white columns, built on generations of old Southern money. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for arriving guests stepping out of luxury sedans. When I handed over my keys, the young attendant cast a fleeting, confused glance at my hideous attire, before masking his expression with practiced politeness. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the private dining hall. The room smelled of expensive perfume, roasted prime rib, and stargazer lilies. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering light over long tables draped in heavy ivory linen. The moment I crossed the threshold, the burning stares began. Preston's elite guests, women wrapped in designer silk and men in tailored dinner jackets, let their eyes linger on my clearance rack dress. I heard the faint, muffled whispers behind crystal wine glasses. I felt their judgment crawling over my skin like insects. I found my assigned seat at the far end of the family table, positioned as far away from the bride and groom as physically possible. My father Clayton sat 3 seats down. He had spent his entire life working as a mid-level corporate manager, constantly striving to break into the upper crust of Birmingham society. Now, sitting among the Caldwells, he looked like a man terrified of making a wrong move. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, avoiding my gaze entirely. Valerie sat beside him, projecting an aura of forced perfection, laughing too loud at jokes she did not find funny. They were drowning in their own desperation to fit in, and they were more than willing to let me serve as the sacrificial lamb to secure their place at the table. Dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. I pushed the expensive food around my china plate, the rich flavors tasting like ash in my mouth. Then came the toasts. The ambient chatter died down as the gentle clinking of a silver spoon against crystal echoed through the dining hall. Preston stood at the head of the table. He unbuttoned his custom suit jacket, holding a flute of vintage champagne in his right hand. The room offered him their undivided attention. He smiled, a slick, practiced expression, and began to speak. A normal groom would use this moment to honor his bride. A decent man would speak about love, partnership, and the future. Preston used his platform to stroke his own fragile ego. He started by praising his own family pedigree, thanking his parents for instilling him with an appreciation for the finer things in life. He talked about success, about climbing the corporate ladder, and about surrounding oneself with the right caliber of people. His voice swelled with unearned pride, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. But Preston could never just celebrate a victory. He always needed a victim to measure his success against. His eyes drifted across the room, sweeping over the wealthy attendees before locking dead onto me in my mustard yellow dress. It takes a certain type of refined taste to truly appreciate an event like the one we are hosting tomorrow, Preston said, his tone shifting from celebratory to mocking. You cannot buy class. You cannot fake success, and you certainly cannot learn proper etiquette from people who spend their weekends digging in the dirt. A ripple of uncomfortable silence washed over the room, but Preston did not stop. He leaned forward, resting his free hand on the table, zeroing in on his target. I always say you can tell everything you need to know about a man by the vehicle he drives, Preston continued, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Some of us drive German engineering because we value performance. Others drive rusted-out pickup trucks because they simply cannot afford a proper suit, let alone a proper standard of living. I suppose we should just be thankful certain people are sitting out the main event tomorrow. We would not want anyone tracking mud onto the marble floors. A collective low chuckle rippled through the crowd of wealthy snobs. They sipped their champagne, highly entertained by the public execution of my dignity. I looked at my parents. Clayton picked up his steak knife, pretending to cut a piece of meat he had already finished, too cowardly to defend his own flesh and blood. Valerie dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, her face flushed, choosing to stare at the floral centerpiece rather than acknowledge the profound disrespect hurled at her daughter. I shifted my gaze to Caroline. My sister sat beside her future husband, beaming. Her eyes sparkled with sheer delight, soaking in the cruelty as if it were a compliment directed at her. She loved seeing me reduced to a punchline in front of her new social circle. My pulse thudded against my ribs, a rapid, heavy drumbeat demanding release. The anger rising in my chest threatened to boil over into a screaming match. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to shatter the fine china and expose Preston for the broke, desperate fraud he truly was. But I remembered Ethan sitting calmly at his desk, listening to the audio recording. I remembered the trap. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I stood up slowly, the cheap polyester of my dress scraping against the wooden dining chair. The movement caught the attention of the room. The chuckles died in the throats of the guests. Preston paused, his champagne flute hovering near his chin, waiting for me to break down or storm out in tears. I smoothed the front of my hideous dress, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my chin held high. I looked directly into Preston's arrogant eyes, cutting through the heavy silence of the dining hall with a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. I hope you enjoy your big day tomorrow, Preston, I said, making sure every syllable carried across the silent room. I hear the ownership team at the Grand Magnolia is very unforgiving when it comes to breaching their contracts. The smug smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a fleeting shadow of profound confusion. He blinked, opening his mouth to formulate a snappy comeback, but I did not give him the chance. I turned my back on the head table and walked out, I did not rush. I took measured, deliberate steps across the expensive carpet, feeling the stunned gaze of every single person in the room burning into my back. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid, thick Alabama night. The moment the doors closed behind me, my purse began to vibrate. I pulled out my cell phone, the screen lighting up with a rapid succession of incoming text messages from Caroline. She called me a jealous, bitter woman. She accused me of trying to ruin her perfect weekend because I was trapped in a miserable, impoverished life. The insults flowed in a toxic, desperate stream. I did not read the rest of them. I silenced the device, slipping it back into my bag. The night air felt heavy with impending rain, sticking to my skin as I walked toward my car. The distant hum of highway traffic served as a comforting reminder of the real world, waiting outside this gated bubble of fake wealth. I started the engine and steered my sedan out of the pristine country club driveway, heading back toward the flickering neon sign of the roadside motel. Preston and Caroline thought they had won the night. They thought my departure was a retreat, but as I parked outside the cheap motel room, knowing Ethan was waiting inside with a leather-bound binder full of financial truths, I knew the real game had only just begun. The groom had just spent his final night of peace mocking the one man who held his entire future in the palm of his calloused hand. The drive from the country club back to the roadside motel felt like a blur of dark asphalt and blinding headlights. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Adrenaline flooded my system, making my hands shake as I parked the sedan under the flickering neon vacancy sign. I slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot, and marched toward room number 12. The humid air clung to my skin, mixing with the suffocating scratch of the mustard polyester dress. I pushed the flimsy motel door open, stepping into a space that smelled faintly of stale smoke and lemon disinfectant. Ethan sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the warm glow of a cheap bedside lamp illuminating his face. He wore his familiar faded flannel, his boots resting on the worn carpet. Resting across his knees was a thick, heavy leather-bound binder. I threw my purse onto the cracked vinyl armchair in the corner and started pacing the narrow room. The words spilled out of me in a rushed, frantic torrent. I recounted every single detail of the rehearsal dinner. I told him about Preston standing at the head of the table, holding his crystal champagne flute, delivering that cruel speech designed specifically to humiliate us. I described the smug laughter of the wealthy guests. But the part that burned the most, the detail that made my voice crack with raw emotion, was the silence of my parents. I told Ethan how my father stared at his steak knife and how my mother pretended to admire the floral centerpieces. They traded their eldest daughter's dignity for a seat at a table of frauds. They chose the illusion of high society over their own flesh and blood. Ethan did not interrupt. He let me burn through the lingering adrenaline, watching me pace back and forth with steady, observant green eyes. When my words finally ran out, leaving me breathing heavy and fighting back frustrated tears, he set the heavy binder on the nightstand. He stood up, crossing the cramped room in 2 long strides, and wrapped his arms around me. His embrace felt like a fortress. The smell of cedar and clean cotton grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of a breakdown. He pressed a warm kiss to the top of my head, holding me until the trembling in my shoulders finally subsided. Then he pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. He reached over to the nightstand, picked up the leather binder, and placed the heavy object into my hands. "I think it is time you saw this," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. I looked down at the worn brown leather. The cover held no title, just a subtle, embossed logo of an oak tree in the bottom right corner. I opened the cover, flipping past the title page. The interior was filled with dense financial jargon, spreadsheets, and legal property deeds. It was an extensive corporate portfolio for a limited liability company. I scanned the crisp white pages, my eyes catching phrases like asset acquisition, controlling interest, and quarterly yield projections. I flipped to a tab labeled Gulf Coast Holdings. My gaze drifted down a column of listed commercial properties until it landed on a very familiar name, the Grand Magnolia Resort and Spa. I traced my finger across the row, reading the bold numbers listed under ownership distribution. The LLC held a 40% majority stake in the entire luxury property. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to process the reality sitting right in front of me. Ethan Roberts, the man my family dismissed as a dirty blue-collar laborer, did not just fix the plumbing at the Grand Magnolia. His holding company owned the establishment. The revelation unlocked a puzzle I had never fully pieced together. When we first met, Ethan told me his family came from the Appalachian foothills, living off the land for generations. What he failed to mention was the sheer volume of that land, or the highly lucrative mineral and timber rights attached to those sprawling acres. Over the past decade, Ethan had quietly liquidated select parcels, rolling those generational assets into strategic, high-yield commercial real estate investments along the wealthy Gulf Coast. He managed his vast portfolio in jeans and a baseball cap, preferring the quiet dignity of hard work over the flashy, hollow display of modern wealth. He was the definition of stealth wealth. He did not need to wear a bespoke suit or drive a leased Mercedes to prove his worth. He lived on positive cash flow, while men like Preston Caldwell drowned in high-interest debt just to keep up appearances. He let his ledgers do the talking, and his ledgers were deafening. My husband was the landlord of Carolyn's dream wedding. The sheer magnitude of the situation hit me like a physical wave. I looked up from the binder, my jaw hanging slightly open in profound shock. I stared at Ethan, trying to reconcile the powerful real estate tycoon documented in these pages with the man who just handed a $5 tip to a valet out the window of a rusty Ford truck. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. My family had spent the last 6 months treating him like an unwanted peasant, entirely unaware they were insulting the king of the castle. Ethan leaned against the cheap veneer dresser, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. "They booked my hotel, Julie," he said softly, his eyes flashing with a sharp, predatory glint. "And based on that recorded phone call you heard earlier, Preston just breached Section 4 of the Conduct Agreement." The ultimate trap was finally revealed in all its brilliant, terrifying glory. Caroline and Preston were pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars of their non-existent borrowed wealth into a business owned by the very man they deemed too poor to exist in their presence. They had spent the entire evening mocking a man who held the legal authority to lock the ballroom doors and leave them standing on the curb. Ethan explained the exact mechanics of the trap. When Preston screamed at the hotel manager on Tuesday, he violated a strict harassment clause designed to protect resort employees from abusive VIP guests. The clause clearly stipulated that any verbal abuse would result in the immediate forfeiture of the venue, with zero obligation for the hotel to refund any prior deposits. Furthermore, the remaining balance for the catering and premium bar service was contractually due 72 hours prior to the event. According to the ledger Ethan just handed me, Preston's final wire transfer had failed to clear the bank. They were trespassing on my husband's property, heavily in debt to his company, and actively violating his corporate policies. Ethan's management team had already drafted the formal breach of contract notice. The paperwork was sitting on the event coordinator's desk, waiting for the sun to rise. Tomorrow morning, while Caroline was getting her hair curled and sipping expensive mimosas, the hammer was going to fall. The minor conflict of a few bounced checks was about to morph into a catastrophic legal disaster for the Caldwell family. I closed the leather binder, the heavy thud sounding like a judge's gavel in the quiet motel room. The scratchy, humiliating fabric of the mustard dress suddenly felt like a badge of honor. I was wearing the uniform of the underestimated, ready to watch the arrogant elites crumble under the weight of their own toxic pride. The tension shifted from defensive anger to eager, burning anticipation. I could not wait for the sun to come up. The grooming hours of a perfect Southern wedding were about to transform into a frantic scramble for survival, and the groom was about to wake up to a nightmare he built with his own 2 hands. The sun breached the horizon, casting a golden hue over the manicured lawns of the Grand Magnolia. Inside the penthouse bridal suite, the atmosphere hummed with the orchestrated chaos of a high society morning. The room smelled of expensive hairspray, fresh eucalyptus, and chilled citrus. Caroline sat perched on a plush velvet stool in the center of the room, wrapped in a pristine white silk robe bordered with delicate French lace. 2 professional makeup artists hovered around her, dusting translucent powder over her cheekbones and pinning intricate curls into place. Crystal flutes filled with expensive mimosas rested on a silver tray nearby. My sister looked radiant, soaking in the undivided attention, playing the role of the flawless Southern bride. I sat in the far corner of the sprawling suite, banished to a stiff wingback chair. I was already trapped inside the scratchy mustard yellow polyester dress. The cheap fabric trapped the morning heat against my skin, serving as a glaring anomaly amidst the luxurious surroundings. My mother Valerie bustled around the suite, steaming wrinkles out of tailored dresses and issuing sharp orders to the room service attendants. Nobody paid me any mind. I was a prop, placed in the corner to fulfill a societal obligation. I held a simple porcelain cup of black coffee, taking slow sips, watching the performance unfold. My pulse maintained a steady, calm rhythm. I knew the storm was coming. I just had to wait for the lightning to strike. The digital clock on the marble vanity flicked to 7 in the morning. Right on cue, a sharp ringtone pierced the light-hearted chatter of the room. Caroline reached for her designer smartphone resting near her mimosa glass, a bright, triumphant smile stretching across her painted lips. She answered the call, putting the device on speakerphone so the entire suite could hear the groom profess his early morning devotion. "Good morning to my handsome future husband," Caroline chimed, her voice dripping with sugary sweetness. The response did not match her joyful energy. Instead of a romantic greeting, the speaker emitted a harsh, ragged sound. Preston was hyperventilating. His breaths came in short, frantic gasps, echoing off the marble bathroom tiles. The makeup artist paused, their brushes hovering in midair. Valerie stopped steaming a silk sash, turning her head toward the vanity. The light-hearted atmosphere vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, suffocating tension. "Caroline," Preston choked out, his voice cracking under a heavy strain of raw panic, "we have a problem, a severe problem." My sister dropped her playful demeanor, her brow furrowing in confusion. She ordered the makeup artists out of the suite with a sharp wave of her hand. The two women scurried out the heavy wooden doors, leaving only Valerie and me in the room. Caroline picked up the phone, taking it off speaker, but Preston was speaking so loud his frantic words bled through the receiver, filling the quiet space. I leaned back in my wingback chair, resting my coffee cup on a coaster, listening intently. Down in the grand lobby, the reality of the Caldwell financial rot had finally collided with Ethan's ironclad directives. Preston explained that he had walked out of his suite expecting to find the catering staff setting up the extravagant floral arches. Instead, he was intercepted by Jonathan, the resort general manager. Jonathan did not offer a polite morning greeting. He handed the groom a thick manila folder containing a revised invoice and a formal, legally binding breach of contract notice. Preston stammered through the details, his voice vibrating with sheer terror. The final payment for the premium catering and open bar service, a sum totaling $45,000, had bounced. The wire transfer failed to clear the holding company bank account. Furthermore, Jonathan produced a physical transcript of the harassing phone call Preston had made days prior, citing a direct violation of the strict guest conduct policy. "They are locking the doors, Caroline," Preston shouted through the phone, the sound of his pristine image shattering, echoing in every syllable. "The security staff is standing outside the grand ballroom right now. They wrapped a heavy chain around the brass handles. They are refusing to let the florists inside. They are shutting down the entire event." Carolyn went rigid. The color drained from her flushed cheeks, leaving her looking pale and hollow. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the marble vanity. Valerie rushed forward, her hands hovering over her chest, whispering frantic questions into the empty air. Guests were scheduled to arrive in less than 4 hours. Hundreds of wealthy Birmingham elites, corporate partners, and high society matriarchs were currently dressing in their hotel rooms, expecting a flawless celebration. If the doors remained locked, the Caldwell name would become a permanent laughingstock. The humiliation would be irreversible. "You have to fix this, Preston," Caroline hissed into the receiver, her voice trembling with a potent mix of fear and fury. "Pay the balance. Threaten him with a lawsuit. Call the corporate office and have that manager fired. Do whatever it takes." "I tried," Preston sobbed, the sound of a broken, desperate man surrendering to a reality he could no longer manipulate. "I threatened to sue the entire property group. I demanded the manager hand over the direct contact information for the ownership board. I told him the owner would have his head on a spike by noon." My grip tightened on the armrests of my chair. I knew exactly what happened next. I could picture the scene in vivid detail. Jonathan, maintaining his flawless hospitality composure, reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. Jonathan pulling out a single heavy stock business card printed with crisp black ink. "He gave me the card," Preston whispered through the phone, the silence stretching across the line like a taut wire. "He told me the only person who holds the legal authority to override a locked venue is the majority shareholder of the Gulf Coast Holdings Group. He said I would have to plead my case directly to the landlord." "Then call him," Caroline shrieked, her composure unraveling into raw hysteria. "What are you waiting for? Read the name and call the man." A long, agonizing pause hung over the line. I heard the faint rustle of heavy cardstock through the speaker. When Preston finally spoke again, his voice was nothing more than a hollow, defeated rasp. "I cannot call him, Caroline." "Why not?" she demanded, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to ruin the expensive makeup applied mere moments ago. "Because I know him," Preston breathed, the sheer terror paralyzing his vocal cords. "The name on the card is Ethan Roberts." The bridal suite plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. Caroline stopped breathing. The expensive smartphone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against the marble countertop. Valerie let out a sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wallpapered wall. The name echoed in the room, tearing down every single delusion of grandeur they had built over the last 6 months. Ethan Roberts, the man they had mocked in the steakhouse driveway, the man they assumed was crawling around in the dirt fixing broken pipes, the man Caroline explicitly banned from attending her wedding because he was a poor nobody who would ruin her precious aesthetic. That same man was currently holding the remote detonator to their entire social existence. I uncrossed my legs, the cheap synthetic fabric of my mustard dress swishing in the quiet room. I picked up my porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid tasted sweeter than any vintage champagne the resort had to offer. Caroline turned her head slowly, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto my face. She saw the calm, unbothered expression resting on my features. She saw the total lack of surprise in my posture. In that singular moment, the realization crashed over her. I knew the whole time, and I let her walk straight into the jaws of the trap. The minor conflict of a few unpaid bills and a thrown $5 tip had instantly morphed into a catastrophic, life-altering disaster. The power dynamic within our family fractured and reversed in a matter of seconds. All the platinum credit cards and leased luxury vehicles in the world could not buy them a way out of this nightmare. They were entirely at the mercy of a man who possessed no reason to show them grace. Preston was still on the other end of the line, his voice a tiny, frantic buzz echoing from the phone resting on the vanity. He was yelling for Caroline to answer him, begging for a solution. He needed a miracle. He needed a legal loophole to force the doors open before his wealthy guests walked down the grand staircase and saw the heavy chains. He told Caroline his family attorney was already drafting an emergency injunction, scrambling to make contact with the holding company. The Caldwells were preparing to unleash their legal hounds, still clinging to the desperate hope that they could bully their way out of the corner. They were about to realize that a fancy law degree means nothing when you are arguing against a signed, ironclad contract. The storm had officially made landfall, and the real panic was only just beginning. I stood up from the wingback chair, the synthetic fabric of my mustard dress rustling in the suffocating silence of the bridal suite. Caroline remained frozen on her velvet stool. She stared blankly at the wall, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths. The mimosa glass she had dropped lay on its side, spilling sticky orange liquid across the pristine marble floor. Valerie was equally paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a hidden exit to escape the incoming humiliation. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply placed my empty porcelain coffee cup on the vanity, turned my back on their crumbling fantasy, and walked out the heavy oak doors. Navigating the plush corridors of the Grand Magnolia, I witnessed the sheer scale of Ethan's silent authority. Down in the main lobby, the usual bustling energy of a wedding morning had ground to a sudden halt. 4 burly security guards in dark suits stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the grand ballroom entrances. Thick steel chains were tightly wrapped around the ornate brass handles, secured with heavy brass padlocks. A team of frantic florists stood nearby, holding buckets of wilting white roses, arguing with a stoic hotel manager who simply pointed to the locked doors. the Caldwell Empire was officially closed for business. I walked out the front doors, handing my valet ticket to an attendant. I drove the 2 miles back down the highway toward the cheap roadside motel. The Alabama morning air was already thick with humidity, sticking to the windshield and promising a blistering afternoon. When I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, I found Ethan exactly where I expected him to be. He was leaning over the open hood of his 1998 Ford truck, a greasy shop rag slung over his shoulder, checking the fluid levels. He wore his faded red flannel and worn denim, looking like a man without a single care in the world. He shut the heavy metal hood with a loud clang, wiping his hands as I stepped out of my sedan. The digital clock on my dashboard read 8:15. Just as I reached the front bumper of the truck, Ethan's cell phone began to vibrate in his chest pocket. He pulled the device out, glancing at the caller identification. He did not recognize the number, but a quick online search of the area code and prefix revealed it belonged to a prominent corporate law firm in downtown Birmingham. Preston was making his move. The groom had called his high-priced legal hounds, hoping a threatening voice in a tailored suit could bully the venue owner into submission. Ethan tapped the screen to answer and hit the speaker button, holding the phone between us in the humid parking lot. "Mr. Roberts?" A deep, booming voice echoed from the small speaker. "My name is Arthur Pierce. I am the senior managing partner at Pierce & Associates, representing the Caldwell family. I am calling regarding a severe misunderstanding that has occurred at your property this morning." Mr. Pierce sounded exactly like a man who billed $800 an hour. He possessed the practiced, authoritative cadence of an attorney used to intimidating small business owners with heavy legal jargon and threats of endless litigation. He spoke quickly, trying to establish dominance right out of the gate. "It appears your management staff has overstepped their boundaries," Pierce continued, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "They have locked the ballroom doors for my client's event over a minor billing delay and a trivial verbal dispute. We are prepared to file an emergency injunction to force the venue open, but my client wishes to handle this amicably. We need you to contact your ground staff immediately and authorize the event to proceed. If you refuse, we will hold your holding company liable for all emotional distress and reputational damage." Ethan leaned against the rusted fender of his truck. He did not flinch at the empty threats. He knew the contract Preston had signed. He knew every single clause and stipulation. The document was an ironclad fortress, designed by lawyers far more expensive than Mr. Pierce. Ethan let the silence stretch over the phone line, allowing the attorney to sit in the uncomfortable void. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady rumble. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Pierce. Your client breached Section 4 of the Conduct Agreement by harassing my staff, and he failed to remit the final payment by the contracted deadline. The doors remain locked." The lawyer faltered, his booming confidence wavering. He cleared his throat, realizing his intimidation tactics had struck a solid brick wall. "Listen, Mr. Roberts, let us be reasonable men. Preston is under a tremendous amount of stress. Tempers flare during weddings. If you just grant the authorization, the Caldwell family will ensure the remaining balance is paid by Monday morning. We are talking about prominent people here. You do not want to make enemies of this family." The sheer arrogance of the request made my blood boil. They were still trying to use their fake status as leverage. I stepped closer to the phone, my shoulder brushing against Ethan's flannel shirt. I leaned down toward the microphone, deciding it was time to introduce myself to the Caldwell legal team. "I am afraid my husband cannot authorize anything regarding this event," I said smoothly, my voice ringing clear and cold in the morning air. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Excuse me," Pierce stammered, clearly thrown off guard by a female voice entering the negotiation. "Who is this?" "This is Julie Roberts," I replied, "the sister of the bride. And as I was explicitly told by your client yesterday, my husband is not authorized to attend this event. Caroline banned him because he is a poor nobody who might ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photos. Since he is not welcome on the premises, he certainly cannot authorize the unlocking of the ballroom." The line went dead silent. The quiet was so profound I could hear the faint sound of highway traffic rushing past the motel. I could practically hear the gears grinding in the attorney's head as he processed the information I had just delivered. Mr. Pierce was a smart man. He realized in a fraction of a second that his arrogant, entitled clients had just committed professional and social suicide. They had insulted, demeaned, and banned the landlord of the very building they needed to save their reputations. A low, agonizing groan escaped from the phone speaker. It was the sound of a lawyer realizing he was fighting a battle he could never win. "You have got to be kidding me," Pierce muttered, his professional facade crumbling into raw despair. "Julie, please tell me you are joking. You banned the man who owns 40% of the hotel you are getting married in? My clients insulted the majority shareholder." I smiled, looking up at Ethan, who was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated pride. "There is no joke, Mr. Pierce," I stated, my tone unyielding. "Ethan is currently unavailable to discuss legal injunctions. He is very busy doing poor people things, like checking the oil in his 1998 truck. Good luck with the injunction." I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call. The dial tones severed their last lifeline to corporate leverage. Less than 5 minutes later, my own cell phone vibrated in my purse. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered the call, bringing the device to my ear. Valerie was not speaking. She was sobbing hysterically, her breaths coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The truth had ripped through the bridal suite like a tornado, tearing down the false walls of their high society delusion. The lawyer had undoubtedly called Preston back, delivering the fatal news that their legal threats were useless. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. Carolyn's perfect day was hanging by a frayed thread over a blazing fire. They could not sue their way out. They could not buy their way out. The realization that they were entirely at the mercy of the man they had relentlessly mocked was finally sinking into their bones. Valerie begged me to tell her where we were. She pleaded for a face-to-face meeting, promising that Preston was ready to make amends. The people who had looked down their noses at us for months were now frantically searching for a cheap roadside motel, desperate to throw themselves at our feet. The ultimate humiliation was in motion, and they had to drive themselves right to our doorstep to face it. At precisely 9 in the morning, the sound of crunching gravel shattered the quiet atmosphere of the roadside motel parking lot. A sleek, silver Mercedes-Benz swerved off the main highway, taking the sharp turn far too fast. The front bumper scraped against the steep concrete incline, producing a harsh, grinding noise that made me wince. The luxury sedan jerked to a halt right behind Ethan's rusted Ford truck, parking at a crooked angle that spanned 2 faded yellow parking lines. The engine was cut short, but the doors flew open before the vehicle even settled. Preston emerged from the driver's side first. The crisp, confident finance executive who had held court at the steakhouse was gone. In his place stood a frantic, disheveled, and broken man. His custom-tailored dress shirt clung to his back, dark patches of sweat blooming under his arms. He had not bothered to put on his suit jacket or tie his silk cravat. His face, usually a mask of smug superiority, was a pale, sickly shade of gray. The deep bags under his eyes betrayed the sheer panic surging through his veins. Caroline stumbled out of the passenger side a moment later. She was still wearing the white silk bridal robe, but the flawless image she had cultivated earlier that morning had disintegrated. Thick black streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, staining the delicate lace collar of her robe. Her hair, previously pinned into perfect curls by professional stylists, hung in tangled, frantic waves around her face. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire world burn to ash. Valerie scrambled out of the back seat, clutching her designer purse against her chest like a shield. Her face was flushed tight with fear, her eyes darting nervously around the dilapidated surroundings. They sprinted across the cracked asphalt, their leather soles and designer heels slapping against the pavement, heading straight for room 12. Heavy, frantic fists pounded against the thin wooden door of our motel room. The hollow sound rattled the cheap metal hinges. I stood near the window, watching through a narrow gap in the curtains, my heart beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. Ethan tossed his greasy shop rag onto the cheap veneer dresser. He did not rush. He took a slow, deliberate breath, adjusting the cuffs of his faded red flannel shirt. He reached out and turned the brass deadbolt, pulling the door open to reveal the desperate trio standing on the concrete walkway. Caroline looked up at my husband as if she were staring at a ghost. Her breath caught in her throat, a choked, ragged sound escaping her lips. This was the man she had mocked for his worn boots. This was the man she explicitly banned from her wedding to protect her precious aesthetic. Now he towered over her in the doorway, casting a long shadow over her trembling frame. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to force a smile, but his facial muscles twitched, betraying his terror. He reached out, extending a trembling, clammy hand toward Ethan. "Ethan, man, buddy," Preston stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot here. Last night at the dinner, the valet thing in the driveway, that was all just a big misunderstanding. We were just joking around. Just some harmless family banter, right? You know how the stress of these big events gets to people." Ethan did not move an inch. He kept his hands resting casually in his denim pockets, staring down at Preston's extended hand with a look of profound disgust. He did not say a single word. He let the silence stretch over the humid Alabama morning, forcing Preston to pull his trembling hand back and wipe his sweaty palm against his trousers. Caroline could not handle the quiet judgment. The reality of her locked ballroom and her arriving wealthy guests pushed her right over the edge of sanity. She pushed past Preston, stumbling into the small motel room. Her knees buckled beneath her weight. The golden child, the high society princess who had handed me a clearance rack mustard dress just 24 hours ago, collapsed onto the cheap stained motel carpet. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out to grasp my fingers. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Julie, please," Caroline wailed, fresh tears streaming down her ruined face, dripping onto my shoes. "You have to help me. You have to tell him to unlock the ballroom doors. The guests are arriving in 3 hours. The florists cannot get inside. The caterers are standing in the parking lot. My entire life will be ruined if this wedding does not happen. I will do anything, Julie. Just name your price. I will pay you whatever you want." I looked down at my sister. The contrast between this moment and the day she handed out her gold-foiled invitations was staggering. Yesterday, she sat on her velvet stool, looking down her nose at my husband, treating us like dirt on the bottom of her shoe. Now, she was sobbing on a dirty floor in a roadside motel, begging the sister she had spent a lifetime humiliating. I did not feel a shred of pity. The empathy I used to carry for my toxic family had burned away, replaced by a cold, quiet clarity. I gently but firmly pulled my hands out of her desperate grip. I took a step back, putting physical distance between us, letting the silence serve as my initial answer. Valerie rushed into the room, unable to watch her favorite daughter grovel on the floor. My mother reached out, grabbing my forearm, her eyes wide with frantic pleading. "Julie, you must stop this right now," Valerie demanded, trying to summon her usual authoritative tone, though her voice shook with fear. "You cannot do this to your sister. We are your family. You have to step in and make Ethan see reason. This is not how we treat each other." I turned my gaze to my mother. I stared into the eyes of the woman who had told me to hide my husband away, the woman who had prioritized Preston's fake wealth over my dignity. "I am not doing anything, Mom," I said, my voice cold and steady, echoing in the cramped space. "I did not lock those doors. Ethan is simply enforcing a legally binding business contract that Preston chose to violate. You wanted Caroline to marry into prominent finance. You wanted high society. Well, this is how high society business operates." Valerie's mouth opened and closed, struggling to form a coherent response. She had no argument left in her arsenal. The conflict had shifted from a realm she understood, the realm of fake aristocratic pride and social manipulation, into a realm of cold, hard legal reality. She could not guilt-trip a signed corporate contract. Preston stood in the doorway, realizing his fake charm and my mother's guilt tactics were entirely useless. He looked at Ethan, his eyes darting back and forth, searching the stoic face for any sign of a lifeline. "Mr. Roberts," Preston breathed, dropping the fake buddy act entirely. "Please, the catering bill. I know the wire transfer bounced. We had a slight liquidity issue with the accounts this morning. I swear on my life the funds will be there on Monday. I will write you a personal check right now for double the amount. Just make the call, unlock the doors." Ethan stepped forward, His sheer physical presence seemed to shrink the room, forcing Preston to take a step back out onto the concrete walkway. The power shift was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on the Caldwells. Ethan was no longer the quiet man in the corner. He was the landlord, the judge, and the jury. "I do not take personal checks from men who bounce wire transfers," Ethan stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded instant obedience. "And I do not care about your liquidity issues. You signed a contract. You harassed my general manager. You insulted my wife. You brought this disaster down on your own head." Preston looked like he was about to collapse. He squeezed his eyes shut, running trembling hands through his sweaty hair. He knew he was beaten. "Is there any way to fix this?" Preston whispered, his voice stripped of every ounce of arrogance. "Is there anything we can do?" Ethan stood tall, the morning sun casting a harsh light over the defeated groom and the sobbing bride. He looked at Caroline on the floor, then at my mother, and finally rested his cold green eyes on Preston. "I have 3 conditions if you want this wedding to happen," Ethan said slowly, letting the gravity of his words settle over the room. The air grew impossibly thick. Preston nodded frantically, ready to sell his soul to salvage his image. He did not know that Ethan's terms were going to cost him far more than just money. The financial ruin was only the beginning. The real punishment was going to shatter the Caldwell empire from the inside out, exposing a secret Preston thought was buried deep in corporate ledgers. Ethan raised one calloused finger. "First," he began, his tone carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence, "you are going to gather every single member of the resort waitstaff, the event coordinators, and the maintenance crew. You will stand in front of them in the main lobby, look them in the eye, and deliver a sincere public apology for your behavior. You will admit you were wrong, and you will treat them with the respect they deserve. If I hear even a hint of condescension in your voice, the chains stay on the ballroom doors." Preston swallowed hard. A public apology to service workers was his ultimate nightmare. He viewed anyone wearing a uniform as invisible labor, people designed to fade into the background while he enjoyed the fruits of his supposed success. To grovel before them, to admit fault to the people he considered beneath his notice, was a swift kick to his fragile ego. But he had 0 leverage left. He nodded a quick, jerky motion of his chin, accepting the humiliating terms. Ethan raised a second finger. "Second, you owe my holding company $45,000 for the catering and premium bar service. I require that balance paid in full immediately. No payment plans, no credit extensions. A direct wire transfer into the corporate account within the next 20 minutes. Preston swayed on his feet, fresh panic flooding his bloodshot eyes. He reached into his trouser pocket and retrieved his smartphone. His fingers trembled so badly he nearly dropped the device onto the carpet before securing his grip. He did not have that kind of liquid cash. His personal bank accounts were already overdrawn from booking luxury transportation and purchasing designer suits to keep up appearances. His only remaining lifeline was his father. Charles Caldwell was a formidable figure in Birmingham. He built his finance firm during the booming economic markets of the late 90s, leveraging aggressive debt to project an aura of untouchable success. But financial markets turn, and risky bets eventually come due. I watched Preston dial his father's number, hitting the speaker button because his hands were shaking too violently to hold the phone to his ear. The line rang twice before a gruff, impatient voice echoed from the small speaker. "What is it, Preston?" Charles snapped. "I am dealing with a severe crisis at the firm right now." "Dad, I need you to wire $45,000 to the Grand Magnolia this exact minute," Preston begged, abandoning any pretense of composure. "The event manager locked the ballroom doors. They are going to cancel the wedding if we do not settle the final invoice. Please, just transfer the funds." A harsh, barking laugh erupted from the speaker. "Are you out of your mind?" Charles roared. "I do not have $45,000 in liquid assets to bail out your extravagant party. We are drowning in corporate debt. The firm is insolvent. I have creditors breathing down my neck and forensic auditors tearing through our ledgers as we speak. The money is gone, Preston. We are broke." The words hung in the air of the cramped motel room, thick and suffocating. The illusion of the Caldwell wealth shattered into a million jagged pieces. I looked down at Caroline. My sister was still kneeling on the stained carpet, her jaw dropped open. The man she was about to marry, the prominent finance executive my mother worshipped, possessed nothing but a hollow name and a mountain of unpaid bills. She had traded my dignity, turned her back on her own blood, all for a ticket onto a sinking ship. She thought she was marrying a prince, only to discover the castle was facing foreclosure. Valerie let out a quiet, horrified gasp, pressing her hand against her throat. Her grand social climbing strategy had just evaporated right before her eyes. The Birmingham elites she tried so desperately to impress were nothing more than well-dressed frauds. Ethan did not gloat. He stepped forward, reaching out to take the phone from Preston's trembling grip. He held the device near his mouth, his expression carved from stone. "Good morning, Charles," Ethan said, his voice calm and methodical. "This is Ethan Roberts." There was a confused pause on the other end. "The plumber?" Charles asked, clearly recalling the false narrative Preston had spun earlier in the week to explain away my husband's rustic appearance. "No," Ethan corrected smoothly, "the majority shareholder of Gulf Coast Holdings, the company that currently holds the lease on your son's wedding venue." The line went deathly quiet. "I know all about your corporate debt, Charles," Ethan continued, delivering the final, devastating blow with surgical precision. "I know about the missed payments, the over-leveraged commercial properties, and the impending audits. I know all of this because my LLC recently acquired the distressed assets of your failing finance firm on the secondary market." The color drained entirely from Preston's face. He looked as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the doorframe. Ethan let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment before twisting the knife. "I do not just own the hotel you are renting today, Charles. I own your entire firm. I own your debts. I own you." A faint, strangled sound came through the speaker before Ethan reached down and ended the call. He handed the phone back to the groom. Preston took the device, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He had spent months mocking a man he thought was beneath him, only to discover that same man held the deed to his entire family legacy. The aristocratic pride of the Caldwell name was dead and buried. Ethan turned his attention away from the ruined groom and focused on the bride still weeping on the floor. He raised his third and final finger. "Third condition," Ethan said, his tone dropping an octave, carrying a protective edge that sent a warm shiver down my spine. He pointed a steady finger at Caroline. "My wife is not wearing that cheap polyester rag you forced upon her. She is not a prop for your cruel games." Caroline flinched, shrinking back against the motel bed frame. She nodded frantically, tears carving new paths through her ruined makeup. "You are going to take your credit card," Ethan instructed, his gaze piercing through her fragile facade. "You are going to march down to the luxury designer boutique located in the hotel lobby. You will pay for Julie to select whatever gown she desires. You will purchase the matching shoes, the jewelry, and anything else she points at. You will cover the entire cost without a single word of complaint." "Yes," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the motel air conditioning unit. "Yes, I will pay for it. Whatever she wants. Just please unlock the doors." Ethan looked at the three broken figures standing in the cheap motel room, the arrogant groom, the cruel bride, and the complicit mother. They had arrived demanding salvation, relying on their usual tactics of manipulation and fake prestige. Now they were stripped bare, exposed as hollow frauds entirely at the mercy of the people they tried to bury. Ethan offered a cold, satisfied smile. It was not a smile of joy, but rather the grim satisfaction of a judge watching a guilty verdict being handed down after a long, grueling trial. "Consider the doors unlocked," Ethan said. "Go execute the wire transfer with whatever credit you have left and prepare your public apology." Preston nodded, turning toward the doorway with the heavy, dragging steps of a condemned man. Valerie grabbed Caroline by the arm, hauling the weeping bride up from the dirty carpet, eager to escape the suffocating weight of my husband's authority. Before they could cross the threshold, Ethan delivered one final parting thought. "And just so we are clear," Ethan called out, causing them to freeze in their tracks, "I will not be attending the ceremony. I would not want my boots to ruin the rustic aesthetic of your precious family photos, but do not think you are off the hook." He stepped back, resting his hand on the brass doorknob. "I will be watching the security feeds from the executive office," Ethan warned. "I will see every move you make. Enjoy the wedding." He swung the heavy wooden door shut, the latch clicking into place with a loud final snap. He shut the door right in their faces, leaving them standing out on the concrete walkway, trapped in a psychological prison of their own making. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the psychological warfare had utterly decimated Caroline and Preston. They now had to proceed with their lavish, high society event, knowing their entire lives were owned by the man they despised. I stood in the quiet room, looking at the man who had just dismantled my toxic family with 3 simple conditions, ready to execute the final phase of his brilliant plan. I left the cramped roadside motel and drove back to the resort with a profound sense of clarity. Resting on the passenger seat of my sedan was a black plastic trash bag. Inside that bag sat the hideous mustard yellow polyester dress, crumpled and permanently discarded. When I walked through the grand double doors of the Grand Magnolia, the heavy steel chains were gone. Ethan had kept his word. The security guards had stepped aside, allowing the frantic florists and caterers to rush into the ballroom to begin their delayed preparations. The wedding was back on, but the dynamic had shifted forever. I bypassed the chaotic lobby and walked directly toward the Magnolia Boutique, the exclusive designer shop nestled in the west wing of the resort. The boutique was a sanctuary of high fashion, emitting the rich scent of fine leather and fresh gardenias. Soft jazz played from hidden ceiling speakers, masking the frantic energy of the wedding setup outside. Caroline was waiting for me near the entrance, still wrapped in her bridal robe, her face freshly scrubbed of the ruined makeup. She looked like a hollow shell of the confident woman who had handed out gold-foiled invitations weeks ago. She stood near a display of imported silk scarves, her arms crossed tight over her chest. I did not offer a greeting. I simply walked past her, heading straight for the premium designer showcase located at the back of the store. For my entire life, I had shopped on clearance racks and budgeted every single purchase. Today, I was shopping with the blank check my husband had forced my sister to provide. A polished sales associate in a tailored black suit approached us, her eyes darting between my casual day clothes and Caroline's bridal attire. "Welcome to the boutique, ladies," the associate said, her voice a hushed, reverent whisper. "How may I assist you this morning?" "I am looking for a gown for a black tie event," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. "Something elegant, something that makes a statement." The associate nodded, gesturing toward a rack of breathtaking garments housed behind a velvet rope. I ran my fingers along the row, feeling the luxurious textures of chiffon, velvet, and satin. My hand stopped on a stunning piece of fabric. I pulled the hanger out into the warm ambient light. It was a breathtaking emerald green silk gown. The design featured a sweeping floor-length hem, a tasteful draped neckline, and a daring open back. The color was rich and vibrant, a perfect contrast to the cheap, dull mustard yellow I had been forced to wear the night before. I took the gown into the spacious fitting room. Slipping out of my everyday clothes, I let the heavy silk glide over my shoulders. The fabric felt like cool water against my skin, settling perfectly over my curves. It fit like it had been custom-tailored for my exact measurements. I stepped out of the fitting room and walked over to the towering 3-way mirror. The transformation was startling. I did not look like the exhausted logistics manager who clipped grocery coupons. I looked like old Hollywood royalty. Caroline watched me from a plush velvet armchair near the dressing rooms. Her jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in her cheek. She was witnessing her own sister effortlessly outshine the rustic, frumpy aesthetic she had tried so hard to enforce. "We need accessories," I announced, turning to the sales associate. "Show me your fine jewelry collection." The associate beamed, sensing a monumental commission. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a velvet tray retrieved directly from the secure vault. Resting on the dark fabric was a pair of real diamond drop earrings, catching the overhead lights and throwing brilliant prisms across the walls. I held them up to my ears, the sparkling gems perfectly framing my face and complementing the deep emerald green of the silk. "I will take the gown and the earrings," I said, turning to face my sister. "You can ring it all up together." The associate led us to the sleek glass checkout counter. She carefully folded the gown into a pristine garment bag and placed the jewelry box inside a branded velvet pouch. She tapped the screen of the register, calculating the exorbitant total. "That will be $8,500, miss," the associate said with a polite smile. Caroline stood beside me, her posture rigid. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a heavy metal black American Express card. This card was her ultimate shield. It was a secondary account Preston had given her, a tangible symbol of her entry into the wealthy elite. She relied on that piece of plastic to project superiority, using it to intimidate retail workers and impress her superficial friends. She handed the heavy metal card to the cashier, lifting her chin in a desperate attempt to reclaim a fraction of her shattered dignity. The associate swiped the thick card through the reader. We stood in silence, listening to the soft hum of the machine processing the transaction. A sharp, aggressive beep echoed through the quiet boutique. The associate frowned, looking down at the screen. "I am sorry, miss," she said, her voice dropping to a discreet whisper. "The card declined." The blood rushed to Caroline's face, turning her cheeks a blotchy, furious shade of crimson. Her eyes widened in sheer panic. She snatched the card back, rubbing the magnetic strip against her robe as if a speck of dust were the culprit. "Run it again," Caroline demanded, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the attention of two wealthy older women browsing a display of leather handbags nearby. "The machine is probably just glitching. Run it again, right now." The associate offered a tight, sympathetic smile and swiped the card a second time. The machine processed the data for an agonizing 5 seconds before emitting the exact same aggressive beep. "Declined," Caroline gasped, the sound tearing from her throat like a physical injury. The financial ruin of the Caldwell empire was no longer a secret confined to a cheap motel room. It was manifesting in real time, right in the middle of a luxury boutique. Preston's father had told the truth over the speakerphone. The accounts were frozen, the liquidity was gone, the fake wealth they had paraded around Birmingham had finally evaporated, leaving Caroline holding a useless piece of metal. She stood frozen at the register, her hands shaking violently. The two wealthy patrons near the handbags leaned in, exchanging hushed, judgmental whispers. Caroline was on the verge of a total psychological breakdown. Her breathing turned shallow, her eyes darting toward the exit. She was about to suffer the ultimate public humiliation of being unable to pay for an item in a store where she intended to act like royalty. Just as a sob began to build in Caroline's throat, the heavy oak door behind the register swung open. The boutique manager, an impeccably dressed woman with sharp features, stepped out from the back office. She assessed the tense situation in a fraction of a second, but instead of asking for a different form of payment, she offered a warm, bright smile. "There is no need to worry about the total," the manager said, her voice loud and clear, intentionally projecting the words so the whispering patrons across the room could hear every single syllable. "Mr. Roberts called down from the executive office a few moments ago. He has already authorized this entire purchase on his personal ownership account." The manager tapped a few keys on the register, overriding the system. A long receipt printed from the machine, finalizing the $8,500 transaction. Caroline stared at the manager, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. Her humiliation was now absolute and inescapable. Her precious black credit card had failed her, exposing her as a fraud to the entire room. And the final, crushing blow was the realization of who had just swooped in to save the transaction. Ethan Roberts, the man she had banned from her wedding, the man she had called a poor nobody. My husband had anticipated the declined card. He knew the Caldwell accounts were frozen, and he orchestrated this moment to ensure Caroline felt the full, crushing weight of his financial supremacy. He bought the breathtaking gown and the real diamonds just to prove a point. I reached across the counter, taking the garment bag and the velvet jewelry pouch from the manager. I thanked her warmly, ignoring my sister entirely. I turned and walked out of the boutique, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the polished marble floor of the lobby. Caroline trailed a few paces behind me, her head bowed, clutching her useless metal card. The psychological warfare had utterly decimated her spirit. She had to walk back to her bridal suite, put on her expensive white dress, and proceed with her luxury wedding, knowing a terrifying truth. She was entirely at the mercy of the man she despised. The illusion of her high society life was dead, replaced by a cold reality where my blue-collar husband pulled every single string. I headed back to my own assigned guest room to prepare for the ceremony. I slipped into the emerald silk gown, fastening the diamond earrings into place. I felt a surge of adrenaline warming my blood. The next phase of the day was approaching rapidly. The guests were taking their seats on the grand lawn, and Preston was preparing to face the music. He still had to deliver his public apology to the resort staff, a condition that was sure to test the last remaining shreds of his fragile sanity. The trap had snapped shut, but the real public execution was just moments away. The emerald silk gown swept against the polished marble floor of the resort lobby. I caught my reflection in the gilded mirrors lining the long corridor leading out to the grand lawn. The transformation felt profound. The cheap, itchy polyester of yesterday was gone, replaced by a garment that radiated undeniable power and refined elegance. The diamond drop earrings caught the ambient light, casting sharp prisms across my collarbone. I took a steadying breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. Outside the towering glass doors, 300 of the most elite socialites in the state were taking their seats for the ceremony. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the golden, late afternoon sun. The moment my heels clicked against the stone pathway, the entire atmosphere shifted. The low, murmuring chatter of the wealthy crowd began to die down, replaced by a wave of hushed, urgent whispers. News traveled fast in Southern high society circles. The Caldwell financial rot might have been a closely guarded secret yesterday, but the events of the morning had undoubtedly leaked. Rumors of locked doors, frantic wire transfers, and a mysterious landlord had permeated the guest list. As I walked down the center aisle to find my seat, the stares burning into my skin were no longer laced with mockery. They were heavy with a terrifying, unvarnished reverence. I spotted Charles Caldwell, Preston's father, standing near the front row. The formidable patriarch, who had dismissed my husband over the phone just hours ago, now looked like a deflated balloon. His custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his shoulders, emphasizing his sudden frailty. When his eyes locked onto mine, his entire posture stiffened. He offered a tight, respectful nod, stepping aside to clear my path. The wealthy women who had snickered at my clearance rack dress the night before now scrambled to make room. A woman in a pale pink designer suit practically leaped out of her prime aisle seat, gesturing eagerly for me to take it. I declined her offer with a polite, icy smile, choosing a spot in the third row where I would have a perfect view of the impending spectacle. The string quartet began playing a traditional classical piece, signaling the start of the processional. The guests rose to their feet in unison. At the far end of the aisle, Caroline appeared, clutching a cascading bouquet of rare white orchids. She wore a stunning couture gown, her blonde hair arranged in flawless, intricate waves. To the untrained eye, she looked like a picture-perfect magazine cover, but I knew my sister better than anyone. I saw the rigid, unnatural tension in her shoulders. I saw the frantic, panicked glint hiding behind her eyes. As she walked down the pristine white runner, her smile appeared strained, trembling violently at the corners. She was not looking at her future husband waiting at the altar. She was looking at the venue. Every time Caroline glanced up at the magnificent floral arches, she was painfully reminded of who truly owned them. Every time her eyes drifted toward the towering marble columns or the sparkling crystal chandeliers visible through the pavilion windows, the reality of her situation crushed the breath right out of her lungs. She was parading through an establishment that belonged to Ethan Roberts, the man she had ridiculed, the man she had banished to a cheap roadside motel, held the deed to the very ground she walked upon. The vows exchanged at the altar felt hollow, devoid of any genuine emotion or promise. Preston recited his lines with a flat, robotic tone, his mind clearly preoccupied with the humiliating task awaiting him at the reception. The ceremony concluded and the guests migrated into the grand ballroom for dinner and dancing. The lavish space featured soaring ceilings draped in sheer silk, towering floral centerpieces, and a pristine white dance floor. However, the air inside the room was thick with an unbearable, suffocating tension. The usual joyous energy of a wedding celebration was entirely absent. The Caldwells sat at the head table, staring blankly at their untouched plates. The guests sensed the underlying dread, exchanging bewildered, nervous whispers over their expensive catered meals. Then came the moment of ultimate reckoning. Before the live band could play their first song, Jonathan, the resort general manager, walked over to the head table and handed Preston a silver microphone. The groom turned a sickly shade of pale. He stood up, his knees visibly trembling, and tapped the microphone. A sharp feedback whine echoed through the ballroom, silencing the murmurs of 300 attendees. Preston looked out over the crowd, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Then, per Ethan's strict conditions, he turned his attention toward the perimeter of the room, where a line of servers, bartenders, and event coordinators stood shoulder to shoulder in their crisp uniforms. "I want to take a moment to address the resort staff," Preston stammered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A collective gasp rippled through the elite attendees. The groom apologizing to the hired help was an unprecedented breach of social protocol. Preston gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning white under the bright venue lights. "Over the past few days, I have acted with unacceptable arrogance," he continued, his tone devoid of its usual boastful swagger. "I verbally abused members of this team, I issued threats, I treated hardworking individuals with profound disrespect. I was wrong. I stand before you all tonight to offer my sincere, unreserved apologies to the staff of the Grand Magnolia. You deserve better, and I am deeply sorry for my behavior." The ballroom plunged into a stunned, deafening silence. The wealthy guests exchanged wide-eyed, shocked glances. They had attended countless high society weddings, but they had never witnessed a prominent groom publicly humiliate himself in front of the waitstaff. The facade of the Caldwell prestige shattered right there on the white dance floor. My parents, seated at the head table, looked utterly shell-shocked. Clayton stared into the distance, his jaw slack, finally grasping the true magnitude of his new son-in-law's ruined status. Valerie turned her head slowly, her eyes tracking across the room until they found me. My mother offered me a weak, trembling, pleading smile. It was a desperate plea for a truce, a silent prayer that I might intervene and somehow stop the social bleeding. She wanted her golden child to be rescued from the nightmare. I held her gaze for 3 long seconds, my expression carved from solid stone, before I slowly and deliberately turned my head away. I refused to offer her a single ounce of comfort. They had made their bed, prioritizing fake wealth over family loyalty, and now they had to lie in the wreckage. I sat comfortably at my prime table in the center of the room. A white-gloved waiter approached, presenting a bottle of vintage red wine on a silver tray. He leaned in, whispering that the general manager had sent the $300 bottle to my table, compliments of ownership. I thanked the waiter, allowing him to pour a generous glass of the dark, rich liquid. I took a slow sip, savoring the complex flavors as I watched Caroline sit rigid beside her broken husband. Her dream wedding had mutated into a permanent monument to her monumental mistake. She could never look back on this day with fondness. Every photograph, every memory, every congratulatory card would serve as a bitter reminder of the day her fragile illusions were dismantled by the very people she tried to destroy. The power shift was irreversible, infinite, and deeply satisfying. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of liberation settling deep into my bones. The evening stretched on, an agonizing parade of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Preston paced near the exit, checking his gold watch every 5 minutes, desperate for the night to end so he could escape the judging eyes of his former peers. He thought the worst was over. He believed his humiliating public apology and his father's frantic wire transfer had fulfilled the strict terms of his surrender. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had forgotten that actions carry compounding interest and luxury resorts penalize unauthorized behavior. As the waitstaff began clearing the dessert plates and the band announced their final set, I watched Jonathan emerge from the back executive office. The general manager was not carrying a microphone this time. He was carrying a small silver tray, and resting in the center of that tray was an itemized invoice detailing thousands of dollars in property damages and overtime fees. Preston was about to learn that the price of arrogance is never truly paid in full, and a certain crinkled $5 bill was about to make a spectacular return. The jazz band played a slow, mournful tune as the clock struck midnight, signaling the agonizing death of the reception. The grand ballroom, once a soaring symbol of high society prestige, now felt like a hollow cavern. Elite guests, sensing the toxic undercurrent that had plagued the entire event, had been sneaking out through the side doors for the past 2 hours. The towering floral centerpieces of rare white orchids were beginning to droop in the ambient humidity, dropping pale petals onto the sticky dance floor. The fairy tale had fractured, leaving behind a grim reality of empty chairs and half-eaten plates of expensive catering. Preston stood near the edge of the dance floor, lingering beside a towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of two intertwining swans. The sculpture was supposed to represent eternal devotion, but the frozen artwork was melting rapidly under the bright venue lights, dripping cold water onto the pristine linen tablecloth below. The groom looked like a hollow shell of the confident executive who had boasted at the steakhouse days prior. His custom-tailored suit jacket was discarded on a nearby chair. His silk tie hung loose around his neck. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, despite the robust air conditioning circulating through the room. He held a glass of watered-down whiskey, his knuckles white as he gripped the crystal tumbler. I watched from my prime table as he attempted to corner a prominent local real estate developer for a forced conversation. Preston was desperate to secure a financial lifeline for his failing family firm, hoping to charm an investor before the rumors of his bankruptcy became front-page news. The developer offered a tight, uncomfortable smile, checked his heavy gold watch, and fabricated a polite excuse to walk away. The elite circle of Birmingham operates on a strict currency of perception. Once the scent of financial ruin permeates the room, the doors shut faster than steel vaults. Preston was a social pariah at his own celebration. From the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains lining the far wall, Jonathan emerged. The resort general manager moved with the silent, practiced grace of a seasoned hospitality professional. He navigated through the maze of empty tables, heading straight for the groom. Jonathan did not carry a bottle of complimentary vintage champagne to toast the end of the evening. He carried a small, polished silver tray. Resting in the center of the gleaming metal surface was a folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper. Preston spotted the manager approaching. A brief spark of naive hope flickered in the groom's tired eyes. He straightened his posture, perhaps thinking the hotel was offering a parting gift or a token of goodwill to smooth over the disastrous morning. He placed his whiskey glass on the table next to the melting swans and waited. Jonathan stopped, offering a stiff, formal bow of his head. He extended the silver tray outward. Preston reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked up the folded paper. He opened the document, his eyes scanning the crisp, black ink printed on the heavy stock. In a matter of seconds, the remaining color drained entirely from Preston's face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The document was a meticulously itemized invoice. It detailed a staggering total of $12,000 in additional fees. The charges were comprehensive and merciless. There were heavy overtime penalties for the security guards who had been forced to lock the ballroom doors. There were exorbitant delay fees for the florists and catering staff who had been held up in the parking lot during the morning standoff. There were steep breach of contract fines triggered by Preston's verbal harassment earlier in the week. The final line item was a damage charge for a shattered antique mirror in the bridal suite, broken during Caroline's frantic panic attack when she realized her credit cards were useless. Preston stared at the bold number at the bottom of the page, $12,000. He had just drained every single liquid asset his father possessed to cover the initial $45,000 wire transfer. His bank accounts were empty, his corporate credit lines were frozen. He did not have $1,200 to his name, let alone $12,000. He opened his mouth to protest, ready to unleash another wave of his trademark entitlement, but the words died in his throat. He could not fight this bill. When he had begged Ethan to unlock the doors that morning, my husband had forced the groom to sign a strict emergency addendum. That legal document explicitly waived all of Preston's rights to dispute any post-event charges or incidental damages. He had signed his own financial death warrant just to save face, and now the executioner had arrived to collect the debt. Carolyn, noticing the exchange from across the room, marched over to the ice sculpture. She carried the heavy skirts of her couture gown in her hands, her feet undoubtedly blistered from her designer heels. The forced, panicked smile she had worn all evening was gone, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. She snatched the heavy paper right out of Preston's trembling hand. Her eyes darted across the itemized numbers, her breathing growing rapid and shallow. She lost her temper. The pristine Southern Belle persona evaporated, revealing the desperate, toxic core underneath. Her voice turned shrill, echoing across the empty dance floor, drawing the attention of the lingering waitstaff. "This is extortion!" Caroline shrieked, waving the paper in Jonathan's face. "We are not paying another dime to this establishment. You have squeezed enough money out of my husband. I demand you waive these ridiculous charges immediately, or I will call our attorneys." Jonathan did not flinch. He did not step back. He maintained a polite, pristine smile, looking at my sister with the calm patience of a man who held all the winning cards. "I am afraid there is no room for negotiation, madam," Jonathan said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "Mr. Roberts was very clear about strictly adhering to the contract. We are simply following the policies your husband agreed to in writing." Caroline opened her mouth to scream another insult, but Jonathan raised a single white-gloved finger, requesting a moment of silence. He reached out and gently took the heavy paper back from my sister's hand. "If you direct your attention to the reverse side of the document," Jonathan instructed politely. He flipped the invoice over and handed it back to Preston. Fastened to the back of the thick cream paper with a small silver paperclip was a piece of currency. It was a single, crinkled $5 bill. It was the exact same wrinkled green paper Preston had thrown at Ethan's chest in the steakhouse driveway. It was the physical manifestation of the arrogant insult, the moment Preston had mocked my husband's rusted truck and told him to buy a car wash so he would not scratch the real luxury vehicles. "A refund for your valet tip, sir," Jonathan added smoothly, offering one final devastating bow before turning on his heel and walking back toward the executive offices. Preston stared at the crinkled $5 bill clipped to his financial ruin. The poetic justice was a crushing weight. The gesture proved that Ethan had orchestrated every single moment of their downfall. My husband had taken their arrogant cruelty, wrapped it in a legally binding contract, and served it back to them on a silver platter. The psychological warfare had reached its zenith, and the victory was flawless. The dam finally broke between the newlyweds. Caroline turned on Preston, her eyes blazing with pure, unadulterated venom. She pointed a trembling finger at his chest, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She blamed him for the locked doors. She blamed him for the bounced wire transfers. She blamed him for exposing her to the ultimate humiliation in the designer boutique. Preston scoffed, his own temper flaring as the illusion of his wealth vanished. He fired back, his tone laced with bitter resentment. He blamed Caroline for antagonizing her billionaire brother-in-law. He reminded her that she was the one who banned the venue owner from the wedding to protect her superficial aesthetic. The hushed arguments escalated into a full-blown shouting match right next to the melting ice swans. The foundation of their relationship had been built entirely on fake wealth, shallow vanity, and social climbing. With the wealth stripped away and their reputations destroyed, only the toxic vanity remained. They tore each other apart, their perfect facade crumbling into fine dust. They had planned to use this extravagant wedding to secure their social standing in Birmingham. Instead, they had finalized their own ruin, locking themselves into a miserable partnership bound by crushing debt and public shame. I sat at my prime table in the center of the ballroom, watching the empire collapse in real time. I lifted my crystal glass, finishing the last drop of the vintage red wine the manager had sent over. The taste was rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. I reached down and picked up my elegant clutch, feeling the soft emerald silk of my breathtaking gown brush against my skin. I did not need to say a single word to them. The retaliation had been served ice cold, and it tasted magnificent. It was time to leave this toxic chapter behind and walk out into a future where the truth had finally set me free. I pushed my chair back from the prime table in the center of the ballroom, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished marble floor. The jazz band began packing their brass instruments, signaling the definitive end of a reception that had felt more like a prolonged funeral. The remaining guests shuffled toward the cloakroom in hushed groups, eager to escape the lingering, suffocating tension that had poisoned the atmosphere. I adjusted the delicate strap of my elegant clutch and smoothed my hands over the luxurious emerald silk of my designer gown. I did not cast a single backward glance toward the melting ice swans or the ruined newlyweds bickering in the shadows. My focus remained entirely fixed on the towering mahogany exit doors. Before I could cross the threshold into the grand lobby, a frantic hand grasped my forearm. The grip lacked its usual sharp authority, trembling with a desperate, nervous energy. I stopped, turning my head slowly to find my mother standing beside me. Valerie looked decades older than she had just that morning. The pristine, structured blowout of her hair had fallen flat, plastered to her forehead with cold stress sweat. The champagne-colored silk of her mother-of-the-bride dress appeared wrinkled and defeated. Tears pooled in the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over the thick layer of expensive cosmetic foundation she had applied hours ago. "Julie, please," Valerie whispered, her voice a fragile, broken reed snapping under the crushing pressure of reality. "You have to talk to him. You have to ask Ethan to cut them some slack. The invoice, the debts, it is too much. Preston's family will be ruined by tomorrow morning. We are family, Julie. Family looks out for each other." I looked down at her manicured fingers digging into my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her hand until she felt the freezing weight of my gaze and slowly released her grip, her arm dropping uselessly to her side. I looked deep into my mother's eyes, searching for any trace of genuine maternal love or protective instinct. I found nothing but the frantic, self-serving panic of a woman mourning her severed social ladder. She was not grieving for me. She was grieving the loss of her country club invitations and her boasting rights among the Birmingham elites. "You made your position very clear, Mom," I replied, my voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that echoed in the empty vestibule. "You told me Ethan was not family. You told me he was just a nobody who worked in the dirt. You chose Preston's fake wealth over my dignity. You demanded I shrink myself to protect Caroline's fragile ego." Valerie opened her mouth to protest, a fresh tear tracking down her cheek, her hands fluttering in a desperate attempt to find an excuse. But I raised my palm, cutting off whatever hollow justification she was preparing to offer. "Ethan is enforcing a contract," I stated coldly. "Actions carry consequences. You wanted to play the high society game, and you lost. Have a good night, Valerie." I turned my back on the woman who raised me, severing the toxic tether that had choked my spirit for 3 decades. I walked through the grand lobby, my heels clicking a victorious rhythm against the tile. I pushed the heavy front doors open and stepped out into the warm, humid Alabama night. The thick southern air embraced me, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. The valet lane bustled with luxury sedans and European sports cars pulling away from the resort. But parked right in the center of the VIP lane, sitting proudly under the glowing amber lights of the hotel marquee, was a battered 1998 Ford truck. Ethan leaned against the rusted front fender. He wore his faded red flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing his strong, calloused forearms. A wide, bright grin stretched across his handsome face. The young valet attendants, fully aware of who signed their paychecks, stood at a respectful distance, treating my husband with profound reverence. Ethan reached into his pocket and handed the lead attendant a crisp $100 bill, a generous gesture standing in stark contrast to the crinkled $5 insult he had endured days ago. I walked toward him, the emerald silk of my $8,500 gown sweeping gracefully over the paved driveway. The visual contrast was breathtaking, high fashion colliding with unvarnished blue-collar grit. I did not care about the bewildered stares of the departing wealthy guests. I reached my husband, throwing my arms around his neck, and pressed a deep, triumphant kiss against his lips. A profound sense of liberation washed over my soul. We climbed into the squeaking cab of the old pickup truck, the engine roaring to life with a deep, throaty rumble. We drove away from the glowing resort, leaving the Caldwell wreckage far behind us in the rearview mirror. In the weeks that followed our departure, the fallout proved spectacular. The Caldwell corporate empire collapsed under the crushing weight of forensic audits and unpaid creditors. The story hit the front pages of the local Birmingham business journals, detailing years of fraudulent ledgers and over-leveraged assets. Charles Caldwell filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, liquidating the sprawling family estate, the leased vehicles, and the country club memberships, just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. Preston, stripped of his trust fund and blacklisted from the finance sector due to his highly publicized meltdown, faced a mountain of venue debt he could not escape. Since he signed the strict emergency addendum, making him personally liable for the damages and penalties, Ethan's legal team offered the ruined groom a very specific settlement arrangement. To pay off his remaining balance and avoid a devastating civil lawsuit, Preston was forced to accept an entry-level position managing the exterior landscaping crew at the Grand Magnolia. The man who had mocked my husband for working in the dirt now spent his days wearing a neon green safety vest and heavy work boots. He pulled weeds, spread mulch, and planted seasonal flowers under the blistering southern sun. He had to smile politely and nod respectfully whenever wealthy hotel guests walked past him, treating him like the invisible manual labor he once despised. Caroline's dream life shattered into unrecognizable fragments. Forced to sell her massive diamond engagement ring to cover their basic living expenses, she moved into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Every time she visited Preston at work to drop off his lunch, she had to park her modest used compact car near the maintenance sheds, staring up at the towering luxury resort she could no longer afford to enter. The psychological prison they had built for themselves was inescapable, bound by public shame and a daily reminder of the man they had tried to destroy. My parents tried to contact us endlessly, my phone filled with desperate voicemails from Valerie and Clayton. My father left long, rambling messages attempting to talk business with Ethan, hoping to secure a financial loan to save his own sinking reputation. Valerie left tearful voicemails offering hollow apologies, claiming she missed her eldest daughter and inviting us to countless Sunday dinners. They swore they had seen the error of their ways, but I knew the truth. They were only chasing the proximity to Ethan's vast, quiet wealth. They did not miss me. They missed the prestige they thought I could provide them. I deleted every single message. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles. I erased their toxic presence from my life with a few simple taps on a screen. Ethan and I returned to our quiet, simple routine in Huntsville. We spent our weekends hiking the Appalachian trails, breathing in the crisp mountain air, and drinking sweet tea on our back porch while watching the sunset over the horizon. The drama of Birmingham felt like a distant, fading memory. I learned a vital lesson throughout the nightmare of my sister's wedding. Real wealth does not need to shout from a mountaintop, demand free champagne, or hide behind leased luxury cars. True power whispers. It wears faded flannel, drives an old truck, and fixes roofs for free. And the greatest revenge you can ever achieve is not found in screaming matches or bitter arguments. It is found by simply stepping aside, holding your head high, and letting toxic people destroy themselves with their own blinding arrogance. The dust has finally settled over the rolling Appalachian foothills, and the quiet rhythm of my life in Huntsville has returned to its familiar, comforting cadence. Sitting on my back porch, watching the Alabama sunset paint the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, I find myself reflecting not on the spectacular ruin of my sister's wedding, but on the silent, decades-long tragedy that built the foundation for it. What happened in that grand ballroom wasn't merely the collapse of a fake financial empire or the bruised ego of a toxic groom. It was the catastrophic, inevitable failure of a specific brand of parenting, a hollow philosophy that plagues so many households chasing the shiny, deceptive veneer of the modern American dream. When I look back at the way my parents, Valerie and Clayton, raised Caroline and me within our traditional four-bedroom home, the ultimate lesson emerges from the wreckage with terrifying clarity. The greatest disservice a parent can ever inflict upon a child is to teach them that the optics of success are more valuable than the substance of their character. In American culture, we place a heavy premium on upward mobility. We celebrate the big house, the leased luxury vehicles, and the prestigious college degrees. We are conditioned to view these external markers as undeniable proof of a family's triumph. My parents subscribed to this illusion with a religious fervor. They believed their primary responsibility was to position their children on a social pedestal, regardless of the ethical cost required to keep us there. They handed Caroline platinum credit cards instead of boundaries. They offered her unearned praise instead of necessary correction. In their desperate attempt to give her a perfect life, they entirely neglected the fundamental architecture of raising a functional, emotionally aware human being. They thought they were showing her love, but in reality, they were crippling her. By shielding Caroline from the natural consequences of her arrogance, by applauding her cruelty when it was directed at anyone they deemed beneath their social standing, they left her entirely defenseless against the real world. A child raised without the steady, grounding presence of fairness and honesty does not grow into a strong adult. They grow into a fragile, terrified imposter, frantically building a house of cards and living in perpetual fear of a stiff breeze. Caroline was never taught how to navigate failure, how to practice empathy, or how to measure a person's worth by the sweat on their brow rather than the label on their collar. When the storm finally hit, she had no roots to hold her steady. She was blown away. Conversely, I look at the man sitting beside me on the porch. Ethan was raised in the quiet, unglamorous reality of generational farm life, where honesty is not a moral luxury, but a survival requirement. His parents did not teach him to conquer high society. They taught him to respect the dirt beneath his boots and the people who toil in it. They instilled a profound emotional awareness that allowed him to see past my family's cruel facade and recognize the brokenness hiding underneath. They taught him that true family responsibility isn't about covering up toxic behavior to save face. It is about holding the people you love accountable to a standard of unvarnished integrity. Ethan's quiet, stealthy wealth was not a product of ruthless corporate manipulation. It was the natural byproduct of the discipline, fairness, and emotional intelligence his family rooted deep within his spirit. When a parent teaches a child that character is their only true currency, that child becomes bankrupt-proof. No bounced wire transfer or declined credit card can ever strip them of their dignity. This brings me to a truth that many traditional families refuse to vocalize, a reality that strikes at the very heart of how we view our obligations to one another. There is a pervasive, almost sacred myth in our society that family loyalty is an unconditional debt, a blood pact that demands infinite forgiveness and enduring sacrifice. We are told from a young age that we must stand by our family no matter how deeply they wound us. But I have learned a much harder, far more unconventional truth. Unconditional loyalty, when demanded by those who offer none in return, is not a virtue. It is a hostage situation. Walking away from my parents and my sister was not an act of malice. It was the ultimate assertion of the very emotional awareness they failed to teach me. Sometimes the most profound expression of family responsibility is refusing to participate in the sickness. By severing the ties, by letting them face the brutal consequences of their own vanity, Ethan and I provided them with the only genuine lesson they had ever received. We stopped shielding them from the mirror. We allowed them to finally meet themselves. If this reflection stirs a familiar ache in your chest, if you have ever had to unlearn the toxic lessons your own family taught you, I invite you to join our community. Hit the like button, subscribe to Grape Echo Stories, and share your journey in the comments below. We are building a space for those who have chosen the difficult, beautiful path of rewriting their own legacy, and your voice deserves to be heard among us. As the final light fades from the horizon and the evening crickets begin their steady hum, I am left with a thought that lingers long after the wedding guests have gone home. We spend so much of our lives trying to assemble a pristine, flawless picture for the world to admire, terrified of the cracks forming in our own foundations. We believe that if we just acquire enough wealth, enough status, or enough social approval, we can permanently insulate ourselves from the messy, painful reality of being human. But look closely at the empire you are building today, whether it is in your home, your career, or the way you raise your children. Are you cultivating a garden with deep, enduring roots, or are you just arranging expensive cut flowers in a crystal vase, waiting for them to wilt? Blood might dictate where your story begins, but it does not have the authority to write your ending. The true measure of your legacy is not found in the inheritance you leave behind, but in the strength of the moral compass you pass down. Ask yourself, when the grand ballroom of your life is finally locked and the lights go out, who will you be in the dark?